Chapter 22. Coming to Grips with the Past. We passed Ellis Island, and before our boat docked, the immigration people came on board to answer questions and arrange details. Doris and I planned to stay a few days in New York, to visit some relatives and old friends, then go on to Chicago. It was wonderful to see familiar faces, but it was very hard to travel alone by subway in a strange city without being able to speak the language. We arrived in Chicago by train on a Sunday morning after sitting up all night, too excited to be tired. I had not seen my parents for more than 7 years. Doris had been 2 when they left for the United States. For 2 years after that, we had no correspondence, until the Red Cross began delivering letters into enemy territory. Even then, the messages could only be 20 words long, but at least we could send or receive some sign of life. While we were in hiding, we used Jovis's name and address on our mail. Although my parents didn't recognize his name, they could tell by my handwriting that we were still alive. Following our arrest in 1944, our communication was cut completely. After a wonderful reunion, my parents hired a taxi to take us to our new home. It was a single room, and I was shocked to see that we would share a bathroom with 5 or 6 other tenants. My parents explained that it was nearly impossible to find living space so soon after the war. They had paid 3 months' rent in advance just to be sure that we had this place. They also had had the room exterminated, but shortly after we moved in, the cockroaches came right back. Although their home was only 1 room, Helen and Doris were lucky to have it. Not only was housing hard to find, it was very difficult for displaced persons even to enter the United States. With all the soldiers returning home, there was a great shortage of jobs. Government officials did not want those jobs taken by immigrants before American citizens found work. Besides, officials claimed, immigration to the United States was no longer a matter of life and death. The end of the war had brought an end to Nazi persecution. This was not entirely true. The Nazis had been crushed, but anti-Semitism still raged elsewhere. During the summer of 1946, more than 100,000 Jews fled Eastern Europe after a massacre at Kielce, Poland. Into occupied Germany they poured, looking for a safe haven. All across Europe, thousands of Jews remained in DP camps, waiting for a country that would take them in. Pressure was building for the U.S. government to change its immigration laws and admit more people. After long argument, a new law was passed, but the changes were not great, and they did not come soon enough to be of much help. By 1949, more than 200,000 European Jews had fled to the newly established Jewish homeland of Israel. In that same period, only 27,000 were admitted to the United States. Because she had family members living in America, it was easier for Helen to enter the country, but she did not find it any easier to get a job, especially one that required a knowledge of English. I was fired from my first job without any explanation and was naturally upset. Only later did I learn that this company never hired Jews. For a time, my mysterious accent had hidden the fact that I was Jewish. But when the truth became known, I lost my job. What a disappointment to find anti-Semitism here in the great American melting pot. My good friend Juro from Amsterdam had given me the name and address of some friends in Chicago, and I called on them. Their brother was visiting, and although I did not know this man, I told him my story. He was sympathetic and offered to train me to become a store manager in one of his dress shops. I accepted his offer, and for the next 11 years I worked for the cotton shops, eventually managing the largest of the chain's 150 stores. It was time now for Doris to start school. Although she was 9 years old, she was put in the 1st grade because she could speak only Dutch. It was very embarrassing for her to be put in a lower grade, because naturally the children made fun of her. But after 6 weeks, she had learned enough English to catch up with her class and did very well after that. At least it looked as though we were getting back to a normal life. Beginning life again in a land with strange customs and different language was very difficult. Many DPs saw the United States as a land of freedom, hope, and positive thinking, a chance for a bright new start. Others were terribly homesick and barely could bring themselves to begin again. Everyone was different, recalled one new American, a girl who had been deported to Auschwitz at age 14. When we arrived, we bent down and kissed the good old American soil, because this finally meant freedom. We were, after all these years, free. But for others, the horror of the past was so great it seemed impossible to build a new life. "We survived," said one Czechoslovakian immigrant, "but our lives were destroyed. Though we look like you, we can never be like you. We wear nice clothes like you. We take vacations like you. But the ones I wanted most, they never arrived in the United States. And we go to funerals and we cry for the ones that we never buried." Some survivors found it impossible to talk about their pasts. By staying silent, they hoped to bury the horrible nightmares of the last few years. They wanted to spare their children and those who knew little about the Holocaust from listening to the terrible stories. Helen discovered that often, when she did try to talk, few people seemed to understand or be interested. I met other survivors who had lost family members, and they were quick to tell me their stories, thinking I would understand because of my past. But very soon I learned that they expected me only to listen to them. They weren't interested in hearing my story or in discussing the details of the Holocaust. And so, for years, I stopped talking about my past completely. Sometimes I did discuss thoughts with my mother. She was disappointed that I did not want to go with her to the synagogue, especially on the high holidays. I never argued with her about it. I just didn't go. One Sunday, when she begged me to go, or at least to fast on the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur, I explained that I never would be willing to go without food again, that I had done all the fasting and endured all the hunger of my life. I tried to tell my mother what hunger really is and what it does to you, but I knew I had not reached her when she said suddenly, "I cannot understand why you always come back with these old stories. Forget those times and what has happened. Nobody wants to hear or talk about this anymore." Finding no one with whom to discuss the Holocaust, Helen began reading. Though she was working in the dress shops 7 days and 2 evenings a week, she made time to study the war years, to read books about the events that she had experienced firsthand. Although she didn't realize it at the time, one day, her reading and study of the Holocaust would prove very valuable. And then, just when she had given up hope of finding anyone who shared her interest, Helen met attorney Robert Waterford. Their backgrounds were as different as could be, but their values and beliefs were very much the same. Robert's thorough knowledge of Eastern European history impressed Helen, and their relationship grew beyond the legal questions on which he was advising her. Within a short time, they had married, but now Helen worried every day about what she would do if Siegfried returned. Jewish tradition says that a widow is not allowed to marry unless witnesses have actually seen her husband dead. Naturally, this was not possible after the Holocaust. And although Helen was not bothered by tradition, she was bothered by what she would say of Siegfried if he suddenly appeared. The thought haunted her, and yet she knew she must carry on with her life. Wanting to share with Robert the people and places that had played such a major part of her life, Helen decided to return to Europe for a visit. 16 years had passed since the end of the war. She knew that some of her friends had died, some had moved, and the familiar landmarks from her past were probably gone or completely changed. Still, she wanted to go. They began to visit Holland, calling on the many Dutch friends who still lived there. It was a wonderful reunion, but being in Amsterdam was extremely difficult for Helen. In this city, I had spent the happiest and saddest years of my life, and my memories of those years were overwhelming. Rarely do I lose control of my emotions, but visiting Herculesstraat where Siegfried and I and our many young friends had started our families and cared for our babies. This nearly broke me. From Amsterdam, we went to Czechoslovakia, for I wanted to visit Krakow. It had changed greatly. It seemed lifeless. The butcher shop was still standing, and the factory where I worked now had a red neon star on the roof. The communists were in power. I found the route we had taken daily to the camp. Robert and I walked slowly through the beautiful Paradise Valley. Every step seemed familiar to me, and many memories, mostly painful ones, returned. After a time, we came out of the woods into a clearing, and there stood the building where I had lived. At first, it looked just as I remembered it. Entering the doorway, I saw the ceilings of the upper floors rotting and bending in the middle. Suddenly, I moved my hand to my neck, searching for something that was not there. I was reacting as I had done daily more than 16 years ago, clutching for the work Krakow pen that had been so useful in closing the top of my dress to protect against the cold. Next, we ventured inside the remains of the camp. There, still visible on the walls, were instructions in German about the conduct of prisoners and guards. On the floor was straw, debris, and filth. Nothing had been done since we left. The building was dying, and I was standing there, alive and well. Never have I felt as victorious and strong as I did that day in Krakow. For some survivors, however, the guilt of having lived when so many others died was overwhelming. A 12-year-old boy, big enough when he arrived at Auschwitz to pass for a teenager, had been spared to work for the Reich. His father, mother, and 7-year-old sister had not. For years, the question haunted him. Should he have stayed with his family and gone to his death like the other children? Was it wrong for him to have lived when all of his family died? And now that he had been spared, what did he have to live for? If such horror and cruelty were what life was about, did he really want to endure it? Other survivors carried no such burden. They did not feel guilty for having lived, nor could they say why they had been spared. But because they had lived, many now felt a duty to act as witnesses to one of the darkest hours in mankind's history. No one could have mourned the loss of nearly all her best friends and the disappearance of millions of brothers and sisters more than I did, and still do, every day of my life. Yet, why should I or any other survivor feel guilty? I did survive, and I have not yet decided what made this happen. Perhaps our chances were better because it was autumn of 1944 before we fell into German hands. Perhaps it was the undying hope or the will to find my child. Truly, I do not know. Because I have lived, I feel I have a responsibility as a witness to see that these crimes of prejudice and racial hatred are never forgotten. My goal is to be sure that the years 1933 to 1945 are never erased from man's memory. My own memories are with me 24 hours a day. The horror, the fear, the pain, and the tears, together with all the love I have received and have given with a grateful heart. I will never forget what has happened, nor should anyone else. This is what inspires me to share my story with others.